everybody. My name's Dave. It's always good. There's a couple of things I'd like to start with. It's always good to follow somebody that says frameworks are irrelevant, and coming from a company that obviously promotes a framework called Scrum. So that's always a good start for any presentation. And the second thing is that obviously everybody from Europe wears jeans and a white shirt and is tall, just in case you wondered what our uniform was. We were all very tall. But actually, I'm not from Europe. I live in the United States of America in Boston, Massachusetts. So I apologize because I've gone very mid-Atlantic. I don't sound English and I don't sound American. I sound something else. So there's a couple of photos about me. Just to give you some context, I've actually got two projects at the moment. One is Scrum.org. I run the Scrum.org organization for Ken Schwaber, one of the creators of Scrum. But my real project is two little boys, George and Harry. George is 3. As you can see, we're doing a sprint review there on his garage. Unfortunately, the stakeholders weren't all impressed, particularly his mother, who said it took over too much of the room. But we dealt with those issues and worked our way forward. And then Harry is 10 weeks old, and he has proven, it's funny, the only reason why jet lag doesn't matter anymore, you know, like normally you're tired because of jet lag's easy compared to a 10-week-old. I have to say that for sure. And obviously I have somebody rootling around in my back pocket like before. Seems to be the standard thing. Anyway, some interesting facts about me that are worth mentioning. I run Scrum for Ken, but in a previous life, I was the product manager of something called the Ration Unified Process. So I developed the RUP. I wasn't the thought leader in it. That was Grady, Jim, Eva, and others. But I marshaled all the cats to actually produce something that was sensible and made lots of mistakes along the way. I then ended up running the research practice at Forrester Research for application development, where I got to visit lots of organizations. I'll be telling some of those stories today. I then got bored talking about it and then built it again. So I ran engineering, product management, architecture for a startup. We grew to 100 people. I realized how hard that was, so I went back to talking about it at Scrum.org. Some contact information if you want to talk to me. Actually, before I talk about this, I need to share a story. I've completely changed the slides based on what Jürgen said, because I want to share a story that illustrates why process can get in the way of delivering value, and why Scrum's a framework and not a methodology. I want to tell you a story that I'm going to take from a book called The Machine That Changed the World, the story by James Womack, the story of lean manufacturing. And I'm going to paraphrase it and cut it up horribly because it's actually a very large chapter in the book, and if I just did it verbatim, we would be here for a day or two. But I'm going to tell you a story about a process. Very simple process. In the book, it's a lot more complex. It's putting a door on a car. 3 guys working in a production line. One guy makes a hole. Another guy paints the hole with anti-corrosive paint. Another guy puts the door on, bolts it on, doors on. It's a pretty simple process. One day, this manufacturing process is running totally fine, but there's 3 guys. And one of the guys has been out the night before. He's been partying. He's met a girl. They're fallen in love. They watch the sunrise together, hand in hand. They're going to get married. So he doesn't come into work that day. The guy that makes the holes is still making the holes. The guy that puts it on is still putting it on. But the guy that paints the anti-corrosive paint, the special alloy stuff, isn't in. So in the 70s, that process would run. What was the first rule in the 70s? Never stop the production line. Never stop it. Never stop it. Why? Because time is money, money is time. We must get this stuff out. So the production line runs continuously. And yes, they can still put doors on without the corrosive paint. Fair enough. My father-in-law, Dan Williams, big man, big ex-hockey player. He's a huge chap, lovely, lovely man, buys one of these cars. He buys this car, and he likes to go to Dunkin' Donuts every morning. Dunkin' Donuts is a place in Boston, very famous place. He likes to get a coffee and a donut. He no longer gets the donut because his wife told him, my mother-in-law, you gotta love her. Yeah. Anyway, she tells him no more donuts, Dan. And she doesn't actually just tell him, she reduces his income appropriately. Pocket money, we like to call it. He no longer has enough money for a donut, so he no longer buys donuts. Very simple process, a very good way of managing people, I find. And so every day he drives to the donut place. One day, he's a big man. He shuts the door really loudly, and it falls off. My God, why is that? Well, it just happens that Dan lives on Cape Cod. Cape Cod is a very moist place. You know, there's a lot of moisture in the air. It's by the ocean. So he takes it back to his dealer, and he says, why has my door fallen off? And he goes, well, we had a bit of that actually recently. Don't worry about it. It's on a recall. We'll get the door fixed. It won't cost you any money. But some corrosion got into the superstructure. It actually caused that. Some cars just haven't had enough corrosive paint. We'll sort it out. So head office is realizing all these doors are falling off. And what do? They form a committee, probably a committee the size of this room, and they get everybody to work through it. And they're like, we need to, IBM comes in, Accenture comes in, McKinsey comes in, Boston Consulting comes in, builds studies and analysis. IBM builds this amazing machine that x-rays it to see if the corrosive paint has been put on. They build a process, that's where McKinsey comes in, to actually pull cars that the paint hasn't been put on out of the production line, goes through a separate production line, requires a new machine to take the door off, another thing which they have to buy from another company, maybe HP, and then they put it on millions of dollars, but they'll never, ever have this problem again. That's how Ford in Detroit would have dealt with it. General Motors would have dealt with it. How would Toyota have dealt with it? They're working exactly the same process. Cars are pretty much the same, how you build them generally. There's some nuances. Same process, 3 guys working on the line, da-da-da. One guy makes a hole, one guy paints a hole, one guy puts the door on. How would they have dealt with it? You know, this guy, let's call him David San. No, that's, you know, it's because it's in Japan now. He happens to fall in love. He's never going to come into work again. He's romantic. He missed work today. How would they have dealt with it? They'd have dealt with it very simply. One guy would have been making the holes. They'd have passed it off and go, hang on, where's David Sam? Where's that Dave guy? Well, he's missing, isn't he? Stop the line. Got a Kaizen moment. We're going to fix this. Okay, what the hell happened? Where is that guy? Oh, you know what he's like. He's a dreamer. He goes off, you know, he's disappeared. Well, how do we fix it? Hey, maybe if he isn't there, I can paint it. Oh, or maybe you can actually make the holes. When David San comes in, all of a sudden they've got this process sorted out. They've fixed it. The line starts. The paint's on. Dan never breaks the car. 2 very different ways of solving the same problem. Autonomy, teams, pushing it down, empiricalism. We're getting feedback into the line. That's the kind of systems we need to build. That's the kind of organizations we need to enable. Did a very cool presentation that told you this morning, much too cool. I like to follow really bad presenters. That's my rule. So that was badly thought through. Very good presentation on some of the techniques you can use to empower, to encourage, to learn as an organization to build these self-empowered teams. When we talk about Scrum, we talk about its evolution, we talk about its history, we talk about its future. We're going to be talking about a process that enables that. A process framework, evil as they may be, a set of ideas, some very, very simple ideas. The other important point about that story isn't just empowerment, it's about simplicity. We're very good. I'm an engineer, I'm a computer scientist. I love building, actually, I'm not an engineer, I'm a computer scientist. I'm a software guy. The engineers always laugh at me when I say that. I love to build complexity into the process. I love to do things, add complexity. When in doubt, add a new process. Add another status to Jira. We always love adding new process steps to Jira. You know, that's great. But simplicity is at the heart of Scrum and at the heart of the whole Agile movement. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that as we go through these slides. So I work for a company called Scrum.org. Interestingly, it was founded by a gentleman called Ken Schwaber, the inventor of Scrum. Ken Schwaber is pretty prolific for a little man. Oh God, I better not say that. Don't record that. He's my boss. Love him. He's very prolific. He's created 3 organizations, the biggest organizations probably around agility. In 2001, after he signed the Agile Manifesto with some of his chums, he kept getting these emails from people saying, I'd like to participate. I'd like to be part of this. So he created, with some other people, the Agile Alliance. He drove it and created it. Unfortunately, he created it completely badly. It took him 3 years to realize this, but ultimately, the Agile Alliance couldn't actually do anything. It was really good at getting people together, really good at sharing, but not good at producing. So he built the Scrum Alliance to produce stuff and to drive new processes, Scrum in particular, or new ideas. He found that that was not working because it was misfocused. It was focused on project management, not software development. That's what he's very interested in, and wasn't quite delivering on the promise and wasn't innovating at the speed he wanted, so he formed Scrum.org. And that's where I work, that's what I run every day. Or that's what I'm involved in. I would say I run it, but you know what? Modern management, it's a bit like herding cats. We have a very simple mission at Scrum.org, and this is interesting that the guy that invented Scrum, there's no word Scrum in its mission, because Scrum it's a framework and set of ideas that can help you do this, but it isn't it. Software development is still our mission. Our mission is to improve the profession of software development. And every day I get up and try to do that, just a little bit better. It used to be to do it a lot better, but then I realized it was full of people that were kind of hard to change. Some stats that are interesting. What's interesting about this is probably the first number. 90% of Agile teams are doing Scrum. Put your hand up if you're using Scrum in your organization. The majority of people put their hands up. Scrum has become the most standard way of it. People that say they're doing Agile, majority of them are doing Scrum. And what's interesting about this is, as a profession, we continuously improve Scrum, make it better. But it hasn't always been this way. Let me take you back. Let me take you back to a time before agility, a time when I was working for Rational, building out something called the Rational Unified Process, a time when we were invited to the Agile Manifesto signing in Snowbird and said, no, we're far too important for that. We're the de facto standard of building software. That arrogance obviously worked out very well for us, didn't it? As the Agile movement gained power and became a thing of the past. But let me take you back to a time when software development was built using something called waterfall. Interesting point about waterfall. Waterfall was a term coined by a gentleman called Winston Royce. He coined it in the IBM Systems Journal, which then was moved into the proceedings of IEEE, cross-syndication, and it became this thing onto itself. He actually, if you read his original seminal paper, he says it is not a good way of building software. It's a good way of managing stuff. He says it's the worst way of building software, interestingly. But obviously it became very popular because managers love it. This idea that the requirements can be defined up front, all of them, that you can sit down and negotiate this big set of requirements with the team, and then that team can go off and build those requirements to that specification. Because you have to have all the requirements up front, that means that you're going to build very large chunks of work. And obviously, that's the most efficient way, in the same way as any manufacturing process. If you can batch it up into huge batch sizes, move it through the process in a streamlined manner. That's exactly why we do it. But unfortunately, as software moved away from just delivering automated processes, as it moved into the world of innovation, which I think was a very important point earlier, this concept of innovation, as it moved into actually being the business, not just automating the business, where it moved into a way that it's a synergistic relationship with the business, that the model that we see over here became obvious. This idea that we didn't actually know what we wanted when we started the project. We knew broadly the destination we were trying to get to, but we didn't know all the details. You don't think that the guys that invented Uber knew exactly what that software was going to do. They knew what they wanted it to do, but they didn't know exactly how it would do that. And along the way, they made lots of experiments, lots of sprints, lots of iterations, lots of deliveries to learn. They didn't know necessarily what technology they were going to use. Not everything about every technology. Yes, they knew they wanted to do AWS. Yes, they knew they wanted to do some form of a very resilient piece of software. Yes, they knew they were going to use an open source stack, but they generally didn't know everything about that technology. As you live in these worlds on these two tangents, it becomes less about process and more about a very different kind of model. And yes, you can, and in the 90s, we tried so hard to do this with the Rational Unified Process, with the tools like ClearQuest, Requisite Pro, all of these tools. We tried so hard to formalize this and to solve this problem with technology, with process, and we didn't manage it. It continued to be a problem. And that's why we saw the emergence of methods like agility. Now, what's interesting is that Scrum was actually described in '86. Now, I look around this room, and in '86, most of you were probably playing toys and watching cartoons and arguing more with your brothers and sisters than doing any work. Or I know in '86, I had a haircut like Rick Astley, and I was wearing Waxadox and trying to be cool, smoking Marlboro Reds. I was very trendy in '86. As you can see, Rick Astley haircuts don't necessarily do very well for later in life. But in '86, these two Japanese gentlemen, who I can't actually say their names, or not effectively. I'm English. We actually, at birth, we're taught not to learn any other language or speak with any other accent, and always do a very bad job dealing with any foreign words. It's a sort of English thing. And so what's interesting is they wrote this paper for the Harvard Business Review. They were doing doctoral research. And they wrote this paper that talked about the new product game. They did research at all the organizations that were really innovating. And at that time, it was Honda, 3M, GE. And they visited all these organizations, and they highlighted 6 things that uniquely defined how they were doing it. These 6 things became Scrum. Let me just talk briefly about these 6 things, keep an eye on time. Built-in instability. There was no structure defined, but there was a goal. And they allowed continuous change to support that goal with self-organizing teams, with autonomy pushed down to the units, to the nodes. And remember, this is '86, when it was very much about mechanization. It was very much around industrial revolution kind of practices. Overlapping development phase, there we call those iterations, or I would prefer to call those sprints. That you were building software continuously. You were working on the ideas maybe for the next thing as you were working. It wasn't a clearly defined sequential process. You were learning by doing. That key aspect of agility and Scrum, that was talked about, Jürgen talks about experiments. You experiment by doing things. You deliver working software to not only to prove that you understand the problem, but to prove you can build software. It's a surprise, and we'll talk about some of the challenges to that in a minute. Subtle control. Subtle control means we don't micromanage. That model that Jürgen talked about, you allow teams to decide how they're going to work themselves, but you give them very clear frameworks to work within, because chaos is chaos, you know? And we want to avoid that, particularly in the Netherlands, which it would be against the law there. An organizational transfer of learning, this idea that actually afterwards we should share these ideas with each other and learn together. This is 1986. What the hell have we been doing? This was all very clear. This paper was something that was read, interestingly, by both Jeff Sutherland and Ken Schwaber. They used to meet in, bizarrely, a Christian religious group, and they met together in this meeting, and they ignored the Christian stuff and concentrated talking about software development, which is a perfect place to do it. And I think it was the only way that their wives would let them leave the house. They had to have a good excuse. We find that's always a good excuse. So they met, and they started formulating the ideas, and then they started experimenting with the ideas in a number of projects. One project that was very high profile was the Fbi Sentinel Program, which they'd spent hundreds of millions of dollars delivering not a single line of software. Ken went in, built a very small team, and delivered lots of software incredibly quickly. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't, everything didn't work, but ultimately they actually delivered something and got working quite quickly. So there was something in this. They then wrote a seminal paper that was 21 years ago, which formed the basis of something called Scrum. And Scrum is very, very simple. 19 pages, and it's described in something that's available to everybody. You do not have to buy Scrum. You don't. It's 19 pages, and it's popularized or described in something called the Scrum Guide. Of course, there's thousands of books that describe it separately, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but ultimately it's incredibly simple. 3 roles, 3 meetings, very simple framework. Sorry, didn't mean to keep saying that, damn it. There it is. It's not a method, it's not a process. It doesn't tell you exactly how to work in your organization, but it defines a series of practices that help you start being autonomous, that help you get empirical project management in place, that help you decide who owns certain things to allow autonomy. But it's a framework, which means that you have to actually think. Now, we proved over and over again that people want a silver bullet. They want to be told how to be agile. You can't. There's some great ideas out there that you can follow and use to help you, but all of them are to help you learn. And ultimately, at the heart, Scrum is that. And Scrum has become incredibly successful. I told you about 90%. Over 500,000 people have been trained. I've come to here from Agile, India, in Bangalore. Dubai after Bangalore is literally like an oasis after a desert. You're like, Bangalore is an overload on the senses. And I think I met 500,000 people that had been trained on Scrum, all of them lining up to talk to me. But, and all of them having their own opinions. There's over 100 books been written. That was a quick sample. I just Googled Scrum books, and this is just within the title, you know, and forms the basis of every Agile approach. Safe, DAD, less, are all Scrum-centric. With Safe, it's just the bottom left corner, because apparently software, the poster is proportional to the amount of money people have in an organization. So there's a lot more in the executive parts of the process. And Scrum is this little left. If you get a magnifying glass, you can see it. Dean's a good friend of mine, so I can say that without any insult. And the Scrum Guide is free for everybody to use. How cool is that? So we should celebrate. We should get out and start partying. It would appear that Dubai, everybody's into house music, electronic music, so let's get out and start thumping the bass. I have no idea what this music thing is, but I'm a software engineer. I don't get out much. But let's celebrate, hey? In my case, celebration would be a new programming language. Let's play with it, or a new book on software development design patterns or something. But apparently you also can talk to people as well. Yeah, but if we're going to celebrate, this is Jim Johnson's Chaos Standish report. Some of you may be aware of this data. I spend quite a lot of time with Jim, and it's kind of worrying. Huge amount of failure in software. It continues 20% broadly. That means for every dollar you spend, you're going to waste at least 20 cents of it, probably, if you've got a large portfolio. If you've not got a large portfolio, you could waste it all. So it's a probability, you know. And half of projects are challenge. Challenge meaning we don't really get what we want. It costs us a lot more money. And in fact, it's so painful that some people end up losing their jobs or leaving the company or losing their marriages, which is another characteristic of software projects sometimes. And 36% are successful, so that's good. That's a really good stat, 36%. It's a bit embarrassing, isn't it, ladies and gentlemen? Our industry, our profession, the thing that gets us up on a Saturday and brings us to a lovely hotel in Dubai isn't super, super successful. If it was any other industry, they would have put a big stamp on it and told us off. They would have said, no way! And actually, the other interesting characteristic is we don't have consistency. If you got 20 Scrum Masters in a room and asked them what a product backlog is, you'd get 21 different answers. And that's not being facetious, because one guy is really smart and says, well, it depends. The other guys actually commit. So each consultant comes with his or her own bag of tricks around Scrum. They bring in their own techniques and approaches. Around agility, they bring in whatever's flavor of the month, and it becomes level of inconsistency. If I asked you what Agile was, you'd talk about velocity. That isn't the heart of Agile, but it's definitely a characteristic. You may talk about some other things. Organizations have taken Scrum, and because they don't want to change, they've put it into an SDLC. Thousands of pages. One company I work with, I went and they said, hey, we'd like to show you our online intranet for Scrum. It was over 1,000 pages of HTML. I'm like, wow, that's an amplifier. It's 19 pages, lots of bureaucracy. Let's add another X that percent, 1,000% to turn it into 1,000 pages. And the majority of organizations are doing something that is called water Scrum full. You may laugh, but in fact, yeah, I really would like it if you laughed more, actually. But anyway, fake smiling, fake laughter, we love those things. So this was spawned when I was at Forrester Research. I was a researcher, and I used to come to talks like this. I'd be carried on one of those Roman things, because analysts are treated really nicely, and I love that life. I'd come in and I'd talk about Agile, and I had one stat that 38% or 35% of projects are doing Agile. This was a few years ago. And I'd come in, and there was a guy at the front row. He looked like a tester. I could tell because when he went to the coffee machine, he put everything out in a nice ordered fashion and was very meticulous. So I was like, he's an interesting character. He said to me as I was presenting, as I was giving him my big, whey, he said, "Are you sure?" I said, "What do you mean? 35%, we did a survey with statistical variance. We know exactly, we hire professionals that do this at Side Forester." He goes, "Really?" I was like, "Actually, I don't know. I just asked them, and this is what they said." So we interviewed over 200 organizations. We spent a great deal of time and got a lot of data out of it. Unfortunately, the biggest and most important piece of information was the fact that majority of organizations weren't doing Scrum. Some of the ISVs were, but no IT company. Everybody was doing Scrum at the team level. But ultimately, they had huge planning exercises up front that happened once a year, and they had software released when it really had to. It sort of piled up like manure, and somebody, when the smell overtook them, opened the door and let their customers use it. They released twice a year, once a year, maybe every 18 months. But they were doing Scrum, apparently. Water, Scrum, Full was the predominant model. Because organizations didn't want to change, that model, organizations are exactly, as Jürgen talked about, they're really good at implementing the processes that are defined. You give them a new process, what do? They bring it into the organization as defined. They don't change. It's really hard to change. Change is incredibly hard. Networks change, hierarchies don't. And most times people have brought Scrum in inside their existing hierarchy, inside their existing model, and that made it very hard to change. Gosh, I'm going to zoom because that was some of my time. So what does that mean? What does that mean? What do we have to do to fix Scrum, to make it more popular? Well, or to make it more used, or to make it more successful. We're very motivated at scrum.org, obviously. It's in our name of our company, so that makes us even more motivated, to keep Scrum relevant and to make it successful. And there's 4 things I'd like to encourage you to think about. These are the things that we're thinking about every day. These are the things that we're bringing out, new thought leadership, new bodies of knowledge, new content on, new ideas, new certifications, new models to support. But even if you don't look at what scrum.org's doing or Scrum Alliance, but just look at your own implementation of Scrum. These are the 4 things I'd encourage you to think about. Value. One of the things that we forget when we do Scrum is really why we're doing it and how we measure that. We spend an inordinate amount of time concentrating on things like velocity and burn down. We talk a lot about pairing. We even talk a lot about happiness and joy and things like that. But we don't talk about delivering business value, delivering innovation, delivering stability, delivering change. We talk about lots of things that are very inward-looking. Dare I call them circumstantial rather than outward-looking, value-based. So we need to think about that. We need to think about how we can bring that to the team, to the organization, to the program, to the product. We need to improve our level of professionalism. There's been too many examples of when people have been doing software development and they've forgotten that at the heart of software development is the ability to say no. At the heart of Agile is the ability to say, no, this is how we do it. This is what we can deliver. I can't lie to you anymore. We need to broaden the support for what I describe as done. We'll talk a little bit about that in an important point, because delivering working software really is delivering working software. It isn't delivering the things that maybe could possibly be working software but look a lot more like working software than what we used to deliver, which is the reality of what we do today. So instead, we need to focus on done in a bit more sense. And the other thing is, Scrum was great, but there was a lot of things left out, particularly around scale. And there's been a lot of movements in the scaling community with SAFe and less to really start thinking about scale. But Scrum still has a few words to say, not about scale in terms of planning, not about scale in terms of HR, of EA, of all those other parts that we need to think about, but scaling about delivering working software. So there's something called Nexus that I'll talk about briefly. Let's talk about these 4 things in a little bit more detail. Let's talk about what measuring value really can mean in your organization. We spend a lot of time trying to pull out the valuable from the wasteful. We try to understand what's important. Now, I developed something called the Rationify process. Well, I was the product manager for it. I didn't drive a lot of the content. I ensured that the content all fitted together and made sense, which the difference between a terrorist and a methodologist, you can reason with a terrorist. Methodologists are an interesting breed that you can talk to them for hours. You think you're on the same page, think you really get it, and they go off and, no, this is it. They're like fundamental. They sort of don't really get it. And one of the biggest mistakes that we made with the RUP, the thing that still wakes me up in a cold sweat at night, is that we told people to do things that were wasteful. Why did we do that? Well, because in some cases, they weren't wasteful. But as soon as you said, this is part of the process, semaphores is a great example, or software architecture documents, or use case realizations, or software architecture design documents, or all of these things that RUP had in it, we told people that these are interesting things that you should think about, but we didn't tell them or didn't really enable them to think clearly on their own. So they took it and applied it and built all this really interesting stuff that was particularly wasteful. We've got to avoid doing that in the future. And we would encourage you to use this as a mechanism to do that. You need to think a little bit about three sort of axes. Current value. What value is my software delivering today? That could be measured in many ways, but these are some examples. Revenue per employee, product cost ratio, employee satisfaction, customer satisfaction, etc. Ability to innovate. How good am I at innovating? That could be installed version index. It could be, the fact that we're running XP on this machine would be a great example if I was at Microsoft that would be a fail. That's a low innovation score when users can't upgrade to the latest version of the software. Vista was a great example of a large failure in that regard. And then time to market. How frequently am I releasing to the market? How frequently is software waiting to be released? Because software only adds value when it's being used by customers. It doesn't add value. We get paid as often as software professionals doing the stuff, writing the code, but ultimately the value ain't in that. The value is in using it. The value isn't in the action, it's in the use. And that's very, very important. So those three things fit together into something a little bit broader. So we start creating this direct evidence, and we start gathering circumstantial evidence, like looking at velocities, looking at burn downs, looking at defect densities, looking at throughput, looking at time to resolution, those kind of circumstantial pieces of data, and then seeing if one affects the other. Looking at if we increase the cadence of our release and reduce quality, great example, what does that help? Does that help us or hinder us? That's an interesting question. Apple seems to have a very strong opinion that no, quality is more important than innovation. And it's starting to hurt them. The reason why it's starting to hurt them is sales are slowly dropping because though Android is a crazy, mad, it's like Bangalore. It's like everything's everywhere and you don't really know what's going on. But ultimately, that level is driving innovation because that model that you talked about of 3 guys in a room doesn't necessarily scale, and if those 3 guys aren't having all the great ideas. So ultimately, you start looking at these figures, comparing one to the other and seeing if those things change. And there's no science to it, unfortunately. Sometimes, depending on the market, depending on the situation, those values change in a positive way when you do something. Sometimes in what you think is exactly the same situation, they don't change in the same way. Why is that? Because it's hard, because it's complex, because when a butterfly flaps its wings in the Amazon, it means that somebody in Dubai gets a headache. Why? I don't know. It's complicated. Unfortunately, it really, really is. So we need to start thinking about a different way of measuring software. We need to start tying that to circumstantial evidence and trying to do experiments to change things to see if that drives change and improvement. We need to think a bit about professionalism as well. So if you go to a doctor and you say, hey, where did you go to school, man? And they say, well, I'm actually a liberal arts major. And then, but I read loads of books on it, and I'm very creative, and I've got lots of good, I've got my GitHub portfolio of great operations. Ooh, I'm not sure I'd work with that guy. I'm not sure, the fact that doctors are one example of a profession where you kind of want to know somebody spent 28 years in education. You kind of want to know that they've been doing this a lot. You kind of want to know that this isn't the first time. The first rule I always ask a doctor whenever they do any surgery, I fell off my bike about 7 years ago on a steel bridge, little steel bridge, and chopped the end off my elbow and broke it at the same time, so all the bits fell into the river. That was useful. Anyway, I remember as I was clogged in this, I know, it was very uncomfortable. And the worst thing is I did my finger at the same time, and all I could see was my finger. I didn't see my elbow. And a policeman arrived first, and then an ambulance. And I was going, oh my God, look at my finger, because it was hanging off. The bone had been broken. And he goes, I wouldn't worry about your finger. Look at your elbow. I was like, oh my God. So I was a little bit worried. But when I was talking to the doctor, I asked him, how many times have you done this surgery? He said, oh, hundreds of times. I'm very glad. I didn't want it to be his first time. I wanted to actually get some idea, combination of his experience plus his actual qualifications. And also productivity. But we trust software all the time to people that we don't know how good they are at building software, really. Maybe we talk to a couple of their references, but many of them haven't got the certifications or the proof of that. With education establishments, we've now starting to build some good software engineering education and science. Maybe not enough yet, but we are starting to get better at this thing. Because we all know that if you do, these people, these amazing software engineers, I've been fortunate to work with a few of them, people like Grady Booch, who are really good at building software. They drive it incredibly well, and they're at least 10 times. You should get a small team of really great people, pay them 5 times the market rate, and you will get 10 times the productivity. And that's an interesting stat. So we've also seen this in the broader world. This is 2 examples. I'm an Englishman. I used to play rugby a lot when I was a kid, and we get beaten. England is a great example. It's 60 million people, a little bit over 60 million people if you count the recent flux of new people. We have a rugby team, so we've got a big population sample. New Zealand has a population of 3 million people, about 70 million sheep. They don't play rugby, though sometimes I'm a little confused. And they have a brilliant rugby team, which is very, very worrying, isn't it? And there's many reasons for that. But ultimately, picking the right team is really, really important. If you had 100 developers, who would you pick? How do you get the best person? Is Scrum Master enough? I don't know. What I do know is it's very crucial to start getting some consistency. You need to get consultants in your organization. They're crucial to driving agility, but you also need to ensure that those consultants are driving stuff in a consistent way. If you get 5 consultants in a room, you're going to get 10 different implementations of Scrum. That's the reality. So we need to think a lot about consistency. We need to start looking at building a pyramid of skills. Maybe working with academia, maybe working inside our industry. Because if we don't, I think we're going to be in trouble. And and that's the example. The reason why I wanted to say this is because if we don't, what I'm really worried about is when examples like this start happening more frequently. These are 2 very high-profile software failures, right? There was Obamacare, healthcare.gov. How could you build a piece of software that's going to be used by, potentially could be used to up to 300 million people, that's the population of the United States of America, and not do any performance testing on it? Well, it works on my machine, Gov. Well, yeah, just wait till 3 million people use it at the same time. Well, we can't test that. That's really hard. Yeah, no surprise. Or Volkswagen. So a software guy was given a story. That story said, this emissions thing when they're doing the test thing? Could you possibly change the performance of the car instantly so it doesn't churn out loads of horrible pollutants? Of course I can, Gov. No worries, I can build that. But isn't that illegal? Yeah, no, I'm a software engineer, nothing's illegal. It's cool. What happens when we have the first pacemaker hacked? What happens when somebody with their iPhone switches off the pacemaker? What happens when I run up to somebody and I press a button and his artificial leg starts doing this? What happens when the first driverless car drives into a shopping mall and kills 500 people and they trace it to somebody not doing software right? We're going to get legislated. We're going to get people are going to be driving us to making sure that we go through loads of standards. We can't afford that to happen because it will destroy innovation, because governments are not good at driving innovation, usually. So we need to improve our profession, not just because of the skills that are very important in your own organization, but because we need to start thinking about values. Now, this is hot off the press. We're going to be adding to the Scrum Guide, where Jeff and Ken are, to explicitly talk about these values, these 5 values of commitment, focus, openness, respect, and courage. These are all the things that you were talking about, Yo. All the things that you were talking about in terms of that makes it joyful in your organization, interestingly, or happy in your organization. Commitment, dedicated to delivering software. Yes, we commit to delivering high-quality software. That's our job. We focus on it. We focus on what's the most important thing, not all the rubbish, irrelevant stuff. We're open. We accept that we're going to have failure, but it's going to be for learning, and we rejoice in it. We respect each other, and we respect the power of the team and our own professionalism until proven otherwise. And we have courage to say, no, Mr. Customer, you can't have all the requirements up front. No, Mr. Customer, I don't actually know but I've got some likelihood. You know, I've got some experience, but I don't actually know. So we start pushing back. I've got two more to do. I'm going to make this very quick. Broadening support for done. So value and professionalism are at the heart of it. Done is also pretty important. If you ask a developer, they use this phrase how often, you know. Well, we're done, but we're not done. What? Software developers have more definitions of done than Eskimos have definitions of snow. Well, we're done on my machine, but when I committed it to main, it all went a bit pear-shaped. But we're done. Oh, I've got it working in main, but I've only got it in a test environment, but we're done. Oh, I've got it working in a test environment, but I haven't got it working in pre-prod, but we're done. Oh, I've got it working, but it doesn't have the right style sheet yet, but we're done. Oh, I've got it working, but I'm not sure it scales, but we're done. Done. We need to really define done. We need to move. We're trying to do this today. We're trying to at least incorporate done into test, to test into done. We're at least trying to say, at least when we're done on a story or a set of stories, that we actually are done in terms of testing. Or at least we're aspiring to that, maybe. But that's not enough. We need to think a little bit out of that box. And this is an idea, the Scrum Development Kit, the idea that we start enabling organizations as part of their transformation, and this is just an idea, this isn't well formed yet, is we actually put in place a mechanism that allows organizations to focus on building technology to allow done to manifest itself. So it comes with a sort of checklist around development environments, definition, practices, infrastructure tools, architecture tools, development standards, API calls, SDKs, all the things that you need to get it done in your organization with a clear definition of what that means. Now, it's a practice. This would be a series of practices that we could bring on top of the framework that is Scrum. The idea that we start building not only done, but done. We start moving out of development into operations with DevOps, and maybe when we combine that with measurement, that we understand the hypothesis or the experiment that we're driving, that we drive a complete definition of done into our organization. So when we release working software, that we not only know that it works across the stack, but we know why we're doing it, and we have measures in place that actually determine whether that has been delivered on. We instrument from day one. We think about the change and the value we're delivering from day one. It's hard, it's almost impossible some days, but that's our aspiration, that's where we move through. And we build an infrastructure with an SDK, a Scrum Development Kit, badly named. I know it's just an idea that Ken and Jeff are working on, just an idea, that we actually use some set of ideas to drive it. Okay, so the last idea is around scaling. Everybody wants Agile to scale now because they've been told that they've got to, most of them. But some people actually care about that. And we know that Scrum works really, really well in situations where you get a cross-functional team, a team that can actually do software that's almost done, working in the chaos of an environment, that take a backlog and deliver it. We know this framework, even though we don't like the word framework, works in that regard. It's very lightweight, it's very simple, 3 meetings, 3 roles. That we know the ideas of backlog and product. We understand the values of Scrum maybe now, and we're starting to practice it. We know it works. These things seems to work. But when organizations take this model and try to apply it in situations where they've got a lot of overlapping domains, where we're stepping on each other frequently, Scrum starts not breaking, but there's definitely some challenges. Now, Ken says it's because you didn't understand his book. Jeff says, oh, well, we need to talk about scaled Scrum. And we sort of at scrum.org have taken a middle view. There's obviously some great techniques, particularly Scrum-centric, like less, that can, and there's a presentation this afternoon about that actually take this idea. But we've actually described not all those things, but just a subset of those things in something called Nexus. This is an extension to the framework, an extension in the framework that allows us to effectively work in teams of teams on a common pursuit, on a common endeavor, on a common product. It allows you to augment some of the ideas of Scrum, add a little bit more discipline around it, add some new responsibilities, add some new artifacts and some new ceremonies. Always good to see you leave Skype on during the presentation. Anyway, it allows you to actually scale it in a little bit. So when we look at this, Scrum has been incredibly successful. When I talk to Jeff and Ken about the success, they are surprised on a daily level. I think its success can be attributed to some very important characteristics. One, the simplicity of the framework. It's easy to implement. It's hard to do well, but it's easy to implement. Secondly, the phrase Scrum Master was a master stroke. Everybody wants to be a master, don't they? They've all watched Kung Fu, that film with Carradine, and they're like, oh, I want to be a master. And so the idea of the phrase really was very popular. But unfortunately, Scrum hasn't been as successful as it should in the organizations it's been adopted. And for the new organizations and the new pursuits, it could get better. So I would argue that you need to think about 4 things to help your Scrum implementation to survive for the next 20 years. You need to think about value. Let's try to fold some value into really driving these teams in an effective way. You need to think about professionalism. Think about the values of Scrum coupled with a professional way of delivering it and consistent way of delivering it in the organization. Don't forget that human beings like consistency. You know, if I made you all stand up and go outside and come back, you'd all sit in the same seats. That's good. Why? Because otherwise you get into arguments and it'll be like all sorts of issues. Everybody now want to come to the front because they want to sit near me. It'll be just embarrassing. So consistency is important, so don't forget that. Agility often talks about self-managed, self-directing teams, but you need some guardrails. You need some consistency to make that work. You need to think a little bit about done. And stop fooling yourselves about done, 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 done. Actually deliver working software. You might not be able to do it today, but try every day to deliver working software. And the last thing is think about scale. That's what I wanted to share with you today. Give you a little insight into the stuff we're thinking at scrum.org and what Jeff and Ken are thinking about driving our industry forward. Hopefully this has been useful. Hopefully you've had some ideas that this has made you think about. And I'm here for the rest of the day. Please feel free to come and grab me and argue about Scrum. I'd love that. I don't necessarily get everything right, but I at least have an opinion. And it's been fun. I think we're done.
Thank you, Dave. So are we done or done?
I think done.
Okay. Thank you. It was super. Actually, we started with Jürgen and Dave, so the bar is set kind of high now. And I had my Scrum Master certificate from Jeff Sutherland. And with this military-style background, he taught me the credo of Scrum. Does anyone know it here? Inspect and adapt.
Yeah.
And before I tell you why I asked you, is Mike Leber here? Ah, you're here. Okay. Then you can forget about inspect and adapt. Actually, we have 2 speakers coming up now. We're going to have in this room Mike Leber, who's really, really interesting because we started this as Agile Middle East, and now we've incorporated calling it Lean and Agile Middle East. And we're also trying to bring professionals and academia together, and Mike is kind of the embodiment of that. He's a Kanban trainer, Lean software development. He's an Agile coach, and he's also from the academia. So he will be talking here about Agile organizations. And in the room next door here, we'll have Usman talking on product management, which is where he share examples on how they do product management at NASA, developing the Curiosity and the Mars program. And he will share examples from Uber. So it's going to take a minute or two to set this up. But please, if you're interested in Mike, stay here. If you're interested in product management, you can go to the other room. And don't forget to put the stickies on the happiness index. Okay, thank you.